I get this at Rio Grande. A lot of you may know of Rio Grande. RioGrande.com. They got a great website, tremendous amount of supplies and techniques and so forth. And at any rate, so I have used theirs. And the variety of stones, of course, that you can use, I generally like to simply call them cabs, but sometimes there are different shapes. For example, teardrop shape. And over here we have an interesting stone that could be used as a bezel set, but creates a few problems, and I'll kind of explain that. Kind of look up here, and I'll do this so you can see it. There's two different drawings. The one on the top is what I kind of comically call a lens cut because it's so thin at the edges, almost like eyeglass. And this I always called it with my students the loaf cut, like a loaf of bread. And if you notice, the sides are extremely high. I've actually seen these for sale here and there. I'm not saying you can't mount them, but the idea of a bezel is to burnish the bezel, the strip, over the edge of the stone, which is much wider at the base, and then it curves in. And that's more of this situation. Now over here is a smaller drawing type of thing, and can pass that around if that helps people. So actually the selection of the cabs you wish to use becomes kind of important. So you can bezel set them. The one that's real thin generally would be prong set or something like that, or maybe nothing, because these edges also, they wouldn't be quite that sharp, but they still can be broken very easily. Years ago, I was getting some information when I was quite green, and this guy who did diamond setting and that said, someone asked him one time, well, how much pressure do you put on the prongs, you know, when you're setting? He said, well, I put about 2 tons forward and about 4 tons backwards. How would you know? How would you answer a question like that? If you snap the stone, well, you use too much pressure. So, you know, there's some interesting things that go on with that and such. Okay, at any rate, I am going to be sharing with you folks a very, very important little simple tool that I learned about in graduate school. These are soldering clips. These things can absolutely save you for soldering processes and so forth, and they're made out of coat hangers. I'm going to show how to make one here this evening, and I have them in different lengths from quite small and longer. This is a very interesting one when you have a bezel soldered to a plate, and then let's say you're going to mount that on a bracelet or something. How do you hold it in place and such? And I have a little diagram for you on this at any rate, and I make a number of these, and that holds that bezel plate down to the bracelet blank and so forth. Then you sweat solder that together, and I'll talk about what the sweat soldering is as well. And so we will look at that in a minute. Now, what I always do with my bezel, before I do any attempt at getting it sized to the stone and so forth, I soften it by annealing. Annealing is taking the work hardening and stiffness out of the metal with heat. So what I would do is use a torch on these soft fire bricks, and I'll be talking about those in a minute anyway. And you want to keep in kind of dull light so you can see a dull red color as you're heating this. Otherwise, you can melt it. And so I would generally leave it in the coil and lay it down, and then I just start heating for an amount I think I need, and then it softens it so that I can get it around the stone real nice. You can bezel set some of the free-form shaped stones beautifully because once it's soft, it will mold in and out. How do you do that? I have made these sanding sticks out of dowels, and I use these for general jewelry making and such, and I use it as a little wood burnisher to go around the edge of the stone. See? Now, I'm going to kind of say these things to you as they come to mind because it's very, very important. When you are actually shaping the bezel and then and I'll talk about getting the two ends together to solder them. Once that's done, you have to reshape it to the stone. And I use these sanding sticks, and I make sure they're at a right angle from my surface as I go around so that I don't put a camber or an angle coming in on the bezel. You want it to be perfectly straight up and down. Now please, if you're going to bezel set, remember this if you don't remember anything else. Never put the bezel down over the stone. You put the stone down into the bezel, because once it's soldered, guess what? You've got to put the stone down inside, and if you haven't paid attention to that and it doesn't fit, you got a problem. See, you got a problem. So that's very, very important. If, for instance, you were to get the bezel soldered down and the stone is too tight, do not pop it down in there to see that it goes. If you're not ready to polish that thing out and this and that, I made this mistake one time years ago. I had to saw cut the bezel off and redo the whole thing. So what you do prior to doing anything with trying to set the stone, drill a hole through inside the bezel area, so if you get the stone in, you can push a little pin underneath and pop the stone back out. And I would always have it offset, not right in the center, so one side starts to lift up. You follow what I'm saying? And you just pop it out of there. Those are some things I learned, again, just by making a mistake. And I was talking to a couple people earlier. You know, a mistake is a learning process. You can kind of, you know, whatever. We've all been there. I've cut this thing 3 times and it's still too short. You know, so at any rate. Now, a couple of other little tricks. If the stone is close but just a little bit large, right around the very base of the stone, I would take one of these little diamond cylinders. You can buy these at Harbor Freight and stuff. Put it in a Dremel tool and just very, very carefully and gently go around the base to slide it in there. It's not going to show. The bezel covers everything and that, you know, unless you're really honest and kind of guilty, you tell the person, well, I always ground some of your diamond away. At any rate, so now another thing I have done, but you really want to be careful, you can use these burrs, and they are what we call an inverted cone burr. They're like this, and of course, you know, they have a cutting surface, and then even on the top, and you can very carefully go right at the base of the bezel with your Dremel tool and take a little bit of, maybe a little buildup of solder or something away to get your stone in there. See? So you begin to kind of innovate things as issues come up and so forth, and we kind of learn that stuff. So I can pass these around, just hold them up, and you'll see those, and they vary in size a little bit and such like that. So now, with the process that we are not going to be doing any soldering and that, I will just basically again be demonstrating some of these things. I'm going to get this out of the way so that most of you or you folks can see. And let me get my specs on. I'm going to go ahead and use this thicker stuff. Now, the end of that bezel is really pretty ugly. It's got an angle on it and so forth. And I will take these smooth-jawed, wide pliers, and I just squeeze that a little to flatten it out. And then I'll take these little shears. They're special for jewelers, and you can get them at Rio Grande and stuff, and I'll cut that off at a real nice right angle, and then I'll flatten it out. And then I'll take, this is a little rod that I got down to a needle point. And so what I do, folks, is, and I'm using a large one because the little ones will require a little different kind of a thing. You just bring this around and pull it as tight as you can and slide it on around, and then where the two ends meet, you pull that real tight. I would take this little scribe and I put a mark there, come up, and then I come over right where that mark is and I cut that off. Now, well, let's see. That's all right, I'll cut it because this stuff isn't going to be wasted, especially since this is such a big cab. that gives me an awful lot of length, and I'll show you what I do here. Don't get older, because, boy, I'll tell you, as the eyes start to go, light becomes a very critical issue. And, you know, having real close light. Okay, now, getting those ends together, I bring it down and I change the whole shape. I'm making it oval, and I will keep going back and forth like this, and back and forth and back and forth until I get them really close. Now, see, there's a certain spring to that bezel material because I didn't anneal it. So please understand that this would not be definitely ready to work because it keeps wanting to snap too far and stuff. But once I get them in place, I have taken these pliers and gone right across the two, and I squeeze it so they come together beautifully straight. You don't want one down a little bit or whatever. Beautifully straight, okay?